Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
We're just
Assalamu alaikum.
wait. Walaikum assalam. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us, and then we'll be starting. So thank you for your patience. Walaikum assalam.
I just have to say that the last session was incredibly amazing. Thank you so much for doing this. It's just brought so much information right at our fingertips. I just wanted to request if we can get maybe the literature or the information that was given out.
Yes.
So we can also share with others.
Yes, you have an opportunity to do that. Once these sessions have been completed, we are going to be sharing this material on our website.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nuzat.
You're welcome, Sheila.
And we want you also to train our community. So we'll talk about that as well. So you will.
Inshallah, inshallah. I just want to be completely and fully well trained so that because I believe in consistent messaging, and I believe in the narrative to be very clear. Otherwise, it creates confusion for everyone. There can't be mixed messages.
That's precisely why we've created these resources, so that the message is consistent and the information we're sharing is consistent.
Yes.
And, you know, people get used to hearing it and acting on it. That's precisely why.
Fantastic. You know, the kind of work I went through your website actually this morning, and I'm really impressed with the work that you've done. And I know it's 30 years of work. It didn't happen yesterday. So I must congratulate you for your commitment, dedication, and persistence in taking this forward to the entire world, I feel, because there's no place for hate in this world.
Absolutely. So good morning, everyone. Salam, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute and then we can get started. We just want to allow more people to join us.
Nusrat, is there more activity on your website since this episode happened?
On our website? No, you mean, are people sending us hate messages?
No. I mean, if people are looking for more information.
Engagement.
Yeah, I think there has been. You know, we put out statements. We've been pushing out these workshops on our socials. So I think there has been, but the other team members would know better because they do a lot more monitoring of our website and our social media channels.
Because this is a great forum for people. I mean, it's easily accessible and there's no time barrier. People can just access it anytime. And it's really well developed and well presented. So I will definitely promote it to as many people as I can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to get started, everyone. Good morning, salams, and welcome to CCMW's Countering Cyberhate 101 workshop. The workshop is second in the series of workshops offered by CCMW's Digital Anti-Racism Education 2 project, funded by the Government of Canada. We're happy you could join us today. I'm Nusrat Jaffrey, Executive Director of CCMW. Most of you met me or may have met me at our last workshop on Anti-Islamophobia 101. And if this is your first time, welcome, and I'm pleased to meet you. In keeping with the tradition of CCMW, I welcome all of you to our workshop today. And I would like to start off with a recitation from the Quran, followed by the English translation. Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min zarrin wa unsa wa ja'alnakum shuban wa qabaila لَتَعْرَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. O humankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes, that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted. And I'd now like to present a land acknowledgement. Even as we gather virtually, it is important that each and every one of us respectfully acknowledges and recognizes the ancestral treaty and unceded territories of all of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples that call our respective lands home. From coast to coast to coast, we deeply appreciate the historic connection of all Indigenous peoples to these lands. We acknowledge the unique and sacred relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the land, water, and all living creatures, and their role in protecting the earth since the beginning. We must be grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and meet here, and thank all the generations of people who have been stewards of these lands for thousands of years. As Canadian Muslim women, we are committed to confronting historical and ongoing colonialism and violence against Indigenous communities, and joining in solidarity with Indigenous communities in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. I'd like to pass it on to Firdaus now, who's going to tell you more about the DARE project, the DARE 2 project. Firdaus, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Nuzhat, and Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good morning. Very, very happy that you could join us today. For those who were there with us last week, you must be aware that our workshops are part of the Digital Anti-Racism Education Project, kindly funded by the Government of Canada's Department of Canadian Heritage. I feel that, as we are seeing the hate grow around us, these workshops are really, really important to start the dialogue on hate, on anti-racism, on anti-Islamophobia. It kind of brings us together as a community, as a forum, and I'm happy that you are able to attend today. So this is part 2 of the series. So you did attend the anti-Islamophobia workshop last week, rendered by Amira El Gawabi. I think it was a fantastic workshop. Spoke a lot about not only the different aspects of Islamophobia, but how we can come together and rally and kind of build community to counter it. So phase 2, or a series 2 of this workshop, is Countering Cyberhate. And we are really happy that you're with us today, knowing that, many of the hate attacks are sometimes, they form on the online forum or on the online platform. We know that the perpetrators are young and they're getting influenced on the digital space. I think that really it is important to be aware about our digital space as we interact with others. So how do we kind of counter extremism? So you might put a comment and you might get trolled, you might get a lot of hate comments. So we want to kind of really work with you how we can counter these effectively. We don't want to counter hate with hate, but effective dialogue. And that's what today's workshop is all about. So another arm of the project, besides these workshops, we're hoping that you take these workshops and go back into your communities this fall and kind of, give these, render these workshops to your community members, whether it's a mosque, it's a university, a school, bring communities together to kind of talk about this. We will be having focus groups in August where we will bring you all together, just so that we can share the resources, we can share presentations. We also have a training manual that will help you to take these workshops into your own communities. And just besides this, we have an anti-hate social media campaign that is a big part of this project, which we inshallah hope to launch in October during Islamic Heritage Month. So we've collected stories of hate, Islamophobia experienced by Muslim and racialized women and girls. And we hope that this is part of a bigger conversation as we launch it in October. Lastly, these workshops that we have in May, June, and July are English and French. If you need more information, if you have family and friends who'd like to register, I think it's really important and imperative that each one of us learn about hate and how to counter it. please visit our website, www.daretobeaware.ca, or you can email me and we have the contact information at the end of it. So just also to reiterate that participants who attend both workshops, the anti-Islamophobia and the Countering Cyberhate, would receive a certificate in digital anti-racism education. So that is the first flag that you will have, and I'm hoping that you're able to take these wonderful workshops and the information you get into your own local communities. So thank you for being with us today. And I kind of hand it over to Jasmine, who is a big part of our team. She's helping with the admin stuff, bringing you all together, a lot of registration work. So thank you, Jasmine. We also have Iman and Zainab, part of our team. And of course, Nuzat, really bringing us together. It's been a lot of work, but when we see the results, we are kind of amazed as to what these workshops can lead to. So thank you for being with us today.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to those who are joining for the first time, and welcome back to those who joined last week. Just going over some learning outcomes. So with the hopes of this session, we hope that you'll leave with an increased understanding of online hate speech and extremism, along with increased understanding of counterspeech and counter narrative, and how to individually and collectively engage in counterspeech online. And so here on the screen, we have some ground rules. These more so apply to the breakout rooms. In the main room, we just kindly ask that you keep yourselves muted. And if you have any questions, please send those questions into the chats. Iman has renamed herself as questions, so please direct your questions to her. And we'll go on break every now and then and ask these questions to Dr. Perry. So for ground rules, make sure you're acknowledging multiple viewpoints and opinions in these breakout rooms. Own your intentions and impact. Step back. So if you feel like you're taking a lot of space, maybe give some space for those who are quiet or are really looking into speaking. Recognize your own privileges and honor the different experiences we bring into this space. Challenge with care and empathy. And once again, please direct your questions to the questions username in the chat box. And so just before we get started with the presentation, we'll just get you guys to do a pre-survey on Mentimeter. So I'll ask everyone to head over to www.menti.com. And this is just, this will be, all the information here will be treated confidentially and will not be linked to you in any way, shape, or form. And these will be summarized in aggregate form to help CCMW effectively plan Dare to programming and inform the project's final evaluation. So I'll get everyone to go to www.menti.com. Iman has pasted that into the chat as well. And that will lead you to a screen in which you'll have to enter a code. The code is also found in the chat. It's 21352334. Right, so what's cool about Mentimeter is that it kind of shows everyone's answers in like a word cloud. And so the bigger the words mean more people are answering using that word. So for example, we have a lot of folks coming from Durham, Toronto, KW, Kitchener-Waterloo, Ottawa, Niagara, London, Mississauga, Brampton. So I'm attending this workshop today as a right. So most folks as community residents. Along with CCMW chapter members. When you think of cyber hate, what words come to mind? Violence, extremism, bullying, vile, pain, hate, trauma, no moderation. Yeah, that's a scary thing. It's not really moderated. It's very anonymous, right? White supremacy, ignorance, hate speech, disrespectful comments, harassment, racism, hurt, pain, gaming, Facebook, isolation, victimization, underrepresentation, misuse of tech. Do you know someone, including yourself, who has experienced cyber hate? So most folks are saying yes. And how much do you know about strategies to counter cyber hate? Right, so most folks saying I don't know much or I know a little. Great, and that's the end of the Mentimeter. And we'll pass it over to Nizat to introduce our presenter today. But before that, just a quick content warning. Some of the content in this module may be disturbing to some people, so please feel free to take breaks throughout the workshop. You can also access our support resource list if you need to talk to someone. So Iman has shared the link to a document which leads to a document with multiple health resources. So feel free to call one of those hotlines if you need any help, but also feel free to take a step back and pay attention to what you're thinking. And I'll hand over to Nizat to introduce our facilitator.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I'm pleased to introduce you today to our facilitator, Dr. Barbara Perry. We are very, very fortunate to have Barbara with us. She is actually one of the foremost authorities on this subject and has written many, many articles and has appeared on many panels. And we're very fortunate to have her as our facilitator. So welcome, Barbara. Dr. Barbara Perry is a PhD and is a professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. She's a director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism and has written extensively in the area of hate crime and right-wing extremism, as well as policing diverse communities, including work on social control in Native American communities. Dr. Perry has made substantial contributions to the limited scholarship on hate crime in Canada. Most recently, she has contributed to scholarly understanding of anti-Muslim violence, hate crime against LGBTQ communities, and community impacts of hate crime and right-wing extremism. So welcome, Barbara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me to help you out with this. I think it's such an important initiative, and sadly, we're reminded exactly how important it was just over a week ago in light of the horrific murders in London. So first of all, I want you to know that my heart and my thoughts are with all of you. I know what an impact it's had on the community, and I hope that our conversations today go some ways in empowering you and helping you to find ways to counter not just online hate, but offline hate as well. I want to start with providing some context around hate in general, what it is that we're talking about here, and both offline and online, because it's, you can't disconnect the two. Often the online narratives actually shape and contribute to offline hate, and offline hate itself we see often sort of has almost a invigorating impact on those online narratives as well. And we certainly saw that in the aftermath last week, where online, far-right online sites in particular were actually celebrating that horrific violence. So they're very much interconnected. What we have here is just an infographic with tracing the officially reported hate crime over the last 8 years or so, 2009, 2017. And I think, you know, we do have a little bit of data after that, but I think it's really important to look here because that 2016 to 2017 increase, 47% increase in that 1 year. Not coincidentally, I think the year after Trump was elected president of the US. And we saw the dramatic increase in hateful narratives, not just in the US, but in Canada as well. And again, that's reflected in offline hate in the form of hate crime. So a really dramatic increase that we rarely see in any category of crime. I think it's important to note too that specific to the Muslim community, that accounted for a large proportion of that increase. There was a 151% increase in anti-Muslim hate crime during that period of time. Now in 2018, the data came down a little bit, there was about a 13% decrease, but in 2019, it went back up 7 percentage points again, and you know, still is at unprecedented highs. So still higher, excuse me, than the previous high of what I guess 2009, where we had 1,482. So an increase then, and then also we're hearing reports of you know, anecdotally from law enforcement that there is an increase in 2020, and already we're seeing an increase in 2021 as well. So we're going to continue, sadly, to see that rise. And just breaking it down by race and ethnicity. Now, racially motivated hate crimes are the most common, followed by religiously motivated hate crimes, and in particular anti-Black violence when we're talking about race, and Arab or West Indian motivation, and then other, which is, you know, sort of multiple races or mixed race, you know, and things that don't fit tidily into the other categories. And so you see anti-Black violence is the most common. If we look at religiously motivated violence, this is quite standard year to year. It's the same. Anti-Semitic violence is most common, followed by anti-Muslim violence. And you see here how extensively anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic violence increased in 2017. Now, I think this sort of underestimates or undercounts the number, because it's so dramatically underreported. Typically, you know, 25–30% of all hate crimes are reported. If that, some communities have lower reporting rates than others. But I think it's also important to come back to the racially motivated hate crimes, because I think that some of them may also, in fact, be motivated, at least in part, by religion, particularly when we look at Arab or West Asian, South Asian, even some of the anti-Black violence, right? There's that tendency amongst the broader population, I think, to collapse race and religion, or ethnicity and religion. So I think there's a broad assumption that if one is Arab or West Indian, to some extent even South Asian, that they are Muslim. And so I think that plays into the dynamics around hate crime as well. So you know, I think again, we'd likely see higher numbers if in fact law enforcement reported multiple motivations, which we don't do in the Canadian context. So just before I move on, just a question, just give yourself a couple of minutes to think here. Where do you think the highest numbers of hate crimes are reported? What provinces, what cities do you think have the highest numbers? And why do you think that might be the case? Just give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Don't need an answer. I just want you to have it in your mind. Okay, I think intuitively you probably are thinking in the right direction. So in that year, 2017, and most years, in fact, this is the kind of distribution we see, where the highest concentration tends to be in Ontario and Quebec and BC and Alberta. So Central Canada and Western Canada, and in particular Toronto and Montreal. And Quebec City to a lesser extent. So, you know, it has something to do with population, obviously. You know, these are the most populous provinces, the most populous cities that we're talking about. But it's not just about the absolute numbers, it's also where we saw the increases, right? Which is sort of separate from the population density. So, 411 additional, that's not percentages, that's 411 additional hate crimes in Ontario in 2017, and an additional 162 in Quebec. So some dynamics, happening there, I think, in terms of political narratives, I think in terms of policy as well, obviously in Quebec, which has a long history of conflict around religious accommodation. Obviously now, as we're seeing, also this legislating of religious representation, as everyone discusses that, clearly an attempt to constrain Muslim identity markers in particular. And I think in Ontario, one of the factors, and we'll see that in a moment, excuse me, is that is also the province that has sort of the highest concentration of far-right groups as well, white supremacist groups. That feeds into the narrative and feeds into the violence as well. So a whole array of factors, I think, play into that. Sort of working our way up the continuum, if you will, looking at what we're seeing now in terms of far-right extremism or white nationalism, white supremacy across the country. This is the sort of typology that we are building up in the study that we're in the middle of right now, looking at right-wing extremism in the Canadian context. And we're seeing, so in the 2015 study that we published, we really were focusing on neo-Nazis, skinheads, white supremacists. They're closely connected, closely aligned, and most of the other kinds of ideologies that we see somehow bundled themselves up within those three main, very traditional, old-fashioned forms of white supremacy. But since then, again, since 2016 in particular, we've really seen a diffusion of the movement, a diversification almost of the movement, and some of these other elements really emerging and becoming even more powerful and more numerous, in fact, than we'd seen previously. So I think one of the greatest areas of growth has been in that element that calls itself the alt-right. I don't like that label. I think there's nothing really alternative about the alt-right. They share the same foundational, white nationalist, white supremacist ideology. They are intent on building a white ethno-state. All that's different about them is their presentation of self, in that they present themselves in much more professional ways, if you will, very coded language, very sanitized language. So they don't talk explicitly about race, for example. So not much different, I think, in terms of the messaging, just in how they present that message. I think the very concerning thing is that we've seen this separating out almost of an explicitly anti-Muslim element associated with the far-right movement. It's not just, that Muslims and Islam is one target of, a broader constellation of targets. Rather, these arms, and some groups like Pegida, for example, which is from the German acronym for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. So these are groups and individuals and collectives that explicitly target Islam and the threat that they argue it represents to Canada and to white Canadians, white Christian Canadians in particular. Sometimes it's connected to immigration, only to the extent that it's Muslim Muslim immigration that they are concerned about. And we see, we also see, anti-Muslim sentiment obviously come up in some of these other elements as well. I won't describe each one, but if there are questions about it, I can certainly answer those later. And again, as I mentioned, a very similar distribution of the far-right groups as there is for hate crime, those same areas: Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia. Now, this was from the 2015 study, and we identified just over 100 active groups. And now we're seeing, 6 years later, in the last couple of years, we're counting about 300 active groups across the country. And that's in addition to, the increasing number of floaters, we're calling them, where there is an atomization of the movement, that the groups are still important, but we're seeing a lot of individuals being drawn into the narratives, being drawn into the movement without necessarily affiliating with a particular group. So they consume the narratives that they find on a whole array of different far-right social media platforms, and sort of carve that into their own ideological mindset. So again, not necessarily affiliating with a particular group, but part of that broader movement, sharing those narratives, including anti-Muslim. And certainly the murders that we've seen and a lot of the violence that we've seen associated with the far right, the most extreme forms of violence, like what we saw in London, like what we saw in Quebec City, how many years ago? So 4 years ago, 5 years ago, those were those kinds of people, right? They weren't affiliated. Neither of those murderers were affiliated with any particular group, but were very much animated and informed by what they had read and consumed on far right websites. So a very dangerous pattern, this atomization. So I'm going to move now from the offline to the online and talk a little bit about what cyberhate looks like. So in terms of some of the data that we have, we know that cybercrimes most commonly targeted Muslims, again, from the hate crime data. Of all hate motivated offenses of uttering threats, 11% were cybercrimes. So not people, shouting in the streets, but actually, sending messages to individuals and to community-based organizations as well. And the solve rate by police of cyberhate incidents of uttering threats is approximately 50%, which is, about the same as it is with other kinds of online crimes, about half. And because they're very challenging. They're very challenging to identify the perpetrators in these sorts of cases. Just want to share a brief video with you now that looks at the continuum of online hate, because it's not just one kind of messaging or one kind of activity. There are multiple pieces involved. So I'm going to ask Jasmine to run that video for us.
Bullying and just general aggression online, things that teenagers experience in social media environments.
The troll is taking some enjoyment out of upsetting someone else on the internet.
The important thing to understand about free speech on the web is that we haven't clearly delineated who makes the tough decisions.
We find that cyberbullying is a very popular buzzword. Sometimes we see bullying going on Facebook walls.
Sorry, folks, were you able to hear the video?
Yes.
We see nasty comments, arguments within comment sections, but we find that young people often don't categorize a lot of online aggression that goes on as bullying. Often they'll refer to it as drama. It's easier for young people to blow off stuff that goes on online to minimize its impact on them. There's a term called the online disinhibition effect, which says that people are less inhibited online because they can't see the person that they're talking to. And there really is a sense of that protection of anonymity that allows people to give rise to these sort of aggressive speech acts. But on places like Facebook, where every identity is tied to a real name, there's still a lot of aggressive speech acts. So I don't think it's as much about anonymity as it is about the distancing fact of the computer screen in front of you. Online and offline bullying are often part of the same social dynamic, that somebody who's getting bullied face-to-face in the hallways at school may also be experiencing aggression online. For most young people, face-to-face bullying is more stressful and has more emotional weight than quote-unquote cyberbullying. And focusing just on cyberbullying ignores a whole range of other dynamics online that young people might find really difficult and really hard to deal with. The tragic cases of teen suicide are really complicated. We do know that in a number of these cases, the young people involved had asked for help and they weren't supported. So rather than telling teenagers they shouldn't be putting content online, I think it's about supporting young people in their day-to-day lives. It's not just about regulating their online behavior.
Essentially, trolling is about disruption, the deliberate attempt to frustrate, confuse, or infuriate a chosen target. It can run the gamut from redirecting someone to an absurd image or video clip, for example, Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up, all the way to going after the friends and family of murdered teenagers, and everything in between. In the mid-2000s, trolling began to take on a specific subcultural connotation for self-identifying trolls, and the hotbed was 4chan's B-board. Self-identifying trolls claim to be motivated by what's called lulz, a corruption of laugh out loud. It implies amusement at the laughed at victim. Trolls believe that nothing should be taken seriously. If you take something seriously, then you deserve it. One of the most problematic forms of trolling is memorial page trolling. They'll post incendiary materials onto the Facebook RIP pages devoted to the recently deceased.
This is 3 days after the accident. I'm trying to organise a funeral for a 15-year-old girl. It destroyed us.
I went and made a new page because that's terrible for anybody to do to anyone that's passed away.
Other trolls are implicitly critiquing media narratives surrounding these deaths, specifically people who are regarded as grief tourists, so strangers to the deceased who post condolence messages on the Facebook pages. A lot of memorial page trolls are targeting those people.
When I first found out that Travis passed away, I just couldn't stop laughing.
The troll is able to set the rules of the game, set the tone of the game. It is fundamentally asymmetrical. But that courtesy is not extended to the target. The target does not get a say. It is often very upsetting and very problematic and arguably very damaging. But it also has the potential of opening up dialogues that otherwise wouldn't be opened up. And regardless of what the troll is actually trying to accomplish, it has the ability to make people think. So what do these behaviors mean? What do they say about the culture out of which they arise, and how does this fit into a larger cultural realm?
The internet has been an amazing development for free speech in general. This has toppled governments, this has helped elect presidents. But anytime you give anyone the ability to speak, there's always the chance that they could abuse that ability. Free speech means something very different online than it does offline. When you're talking about speech offline, what you're usually talking about is interference with your speech by the government. But when it comes to just private censorship, what the First Amendment provides is just the benefit of history. Online service providers can have a lot to learn from the courts struggling with these issues when they set their rules within a community. Take the example of the Innocence of Muslims case. The video was put up online and it prompted protests throughout the Arab world. I certainly do not envy Google at all. They had to decide in the moment the value of the video as a provocation for further discussion with the legitimate danger to life and limb that the reaction to that video will engender. There's this weird fiction that equates free speech with speech without criticism. That is not only wrong, it's somewhat antithetical to what the First Amendment is all about. I think the most productive solution will always be making people understand how their words affect you. So solutions on anonymity have to recognize that the people we're trying to protect by forcing people to reveal their true names online are often the people that are speaking anonymously online. Think of the kid who is gay and is in a high school where that revelation would lead to physical abuse for him. You can take the example of a victim of domestic violence. You can take the example of a dissident fighting against a foreign government where their identity would cause the government to simply find them and kill them. I don't think there's anything about the internet that turned us all into evil people. We are perhaps seeing more about each other. Whenever you confront bad speech, you have to think about why is that person saying what they're saying. The future of speech online is largely going to rest on who we decide to govern what goes on the web.
I refer to trolls as agents of cultural digestion. You can look at what the trolls are doing and extrapolate out what larger trends are going on.
So it's not necessarily about trying to fix the internet. It's about taking a long look at the culture in which we live in and our values and seeing how those play out in technical spaces like the internet.
In cases of free speech online, who makes the tough decisions? Right now it's resting on the corporations. And while they've been very careful to date, there's nothing structurally that limits them from taking a different approach in the future.
Great, thank you, Jasmine. I think, yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, good. Yeah, so I think what's important here to note is that there are multiple forms that online hate takes, obviously, in an array of different platforms. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. I think the other piece to be aware of is, and I'm sure you are very much aware of, it's not just a problem for youth, right? It's not just youth who are being targeted by trolls or by bullies. And for me, bullying is just another form of hate crime, to be honest. But obviously adults are also targeted. And it's also not just, individual human beings that are targeted. Organizations are also targets. And I'm sure that the CCMW has some stories to share about, hate messages that they probably receive, as I know that National Council for Canadian Muslims, for example, does as well, and whole communities, right? In terms of, messages that are sent about, sort of the messages that are sent that vilify the whole community, websites that are devoted, like the Pegida websites that are devoted to the vilification of the Muslim community, for example. So there are a whole array of locations and sort of forms that online hate takes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. One of the issues that was raised in the video was really about regulation and how we manage that, both from a legal perspective and at the government level, but also how social media companies themselves. So I just want you to take a few minutes in your breakout rooms, and Jasmine will explain how these will work. And think about these questions before I go on to give you the answers. And so how is online hate currently regulated by government and by big tech? So what is the legislation? What are the regulatory rules and strategies that big tech use, for example? And what do you see as the limitations of the forms of regulation that we currently have? So I am going to turn it over to Jasmine, and she will explain for you.
Perfect, thanks, Dr. Perry. So I'll be sending over a link to the Google Jamboard into the chat right now. And so once you open up that link, it will lead you to this webpage. And as you are entering your breakout rooms, pay attention to the room you're entering in. So once you're moved into the breakout room, it will say either breakout room 1, 2, 3, or so forth at the top of the pop-up. And so once you're up to this screen, you just click on the arrow to go to the selected page. So if you're in breakout room 2, you go to breakout room 2, and you provide your feedback under each question. So you would click on the sticky note, which is just the fourth icon on the control panel on the left, and just kind of write out your thoughts and paste them onto the Jamboard itself. Great, so I'll move everyone into the breakout rooms. You'll have 8 minutes to fill up the Jamboard. Feel free to unmute yourselves, turn on your videos if you want to boost up engagement with your peers. Hi, Rishma. I'll just assign you to a breakout room for the remaining time.
Did you get my point?
I think we're all back now, are we?
Yes, looks like everyone's back.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, thank you for participating in that. There'll be a couple of these as we go along, just to give you an opportunity to think and to share some of your thoughts on the issues we're exploring here. So the questions here were: how is online hate currently regulated by government and by big tech, and what are the limitations of each? So I won't go through each of these, but just to give you a sense. And again, we're sort of recording these and taking account of them, and I think they'll be included in our final package. So I think that there is considerable, I'm just sort of the big picture here, considerable concern about the lack of regulation at both levels, both in terms of, the formal strategies by which hate speech could be regulated online and the extent to which it actually is regulated. That is the extent to which government regulation is brought into action and the limitations there. Big tech failure, censorship, social media companies, influenced by the US and their sort of free speech absolutism in the US. Countering messages, so support, power and control, Not sure. Yeah, and I think the fact that so many people are not sure suggests something about the transparency and the failure to enhance public awareness about regulations. Should be stricter rules. Yeah, so I think, you know, I think we're all fairly critical of what we see. So I'm going to come back now into the screen. Okay, so that said, let's take a little bit closer look explicitly at what we've got. And you're right, we don't have a whole lot in terms of regulation of online hate. I think the key pieces of legislation are probably in the criminal code anyway, public incitement of hatred, section 319.1 and 319.2, and to a lesser extent 318 as well. And these are really meant to put impose sort of criminal engagement, if you will, on hate speech that is intended to stir up hatred. And interestingly, in the UK, it actually are called stirring up offenses. That is the intent to create an environment that bestows hostility on identifiable groups and the willful promotion as well. Now, we do have hate crime legislation of a sort, but that is really only at the sentencing stage. So we don't have any predicate offenses that are in themselves hate crimes. So police cannot lay a hate crime charge. That is, they can lay an assault charge and then, you know, gather the evidence that's necessary, and the Crown can pursue sentencing enhancement once a conviction is in place. But you're absolutely right. We don't impose this legislation. So, for example, one study just found, and this was just released by Justice Canada, between 2007 and 2018, that sentencing enhancement legislation appears to have been invoked only in 48 cases. 48 cases. Right? And think about what the numbers were, you know, 1,500 a year to, you know, over 2,000 cases a year. And yet that's all. In terms of the section 319 here, that is what we call the hate propaganda offenses. Another study found that between 2009 and 2017, 37 cases made it through the courts. And a large proportion of them actually resulted in findings of not guilty. So very limited legislation and very limited use of that legislation as well. We also, of course, have the Human Rights Commission, so that there's a way to pursue claims of discrimination, including, you know, hateful speech, through human rights commissions, and so you can see the way that hate crime is defined there, and it's very much like the definition in the hate crime sentencing legislation. Now, of course, there are conversations afoot about reintroducing something like Section 13 of the Human Rights Code. That was a defense, a civil defense against hate speech. You know, the legislation that's currently under consideration is not quite the same, and is intended to constrain hate speech from a criminal perspective. But it's unlikely to be passed before the election, so that's likely going to die on the table. So I think it's really important that we continue to bring pressure to bear on the government to enhance the enforcement of existing legislation, but also to introduce more effective legislation. Now, looking at the social media companies, of course, you know, we're all aware that they do, in fact, have community codes of conduct that are intended to constrain hate speech by deplatforming folks or suspending their accounts for short periods of time, that sort of thing. And you see here how they define hate speech specifically. And of course, we also know they've been very slow. We've actually been working with Facebook to some extent to help them to define what is is meant by not just hate speech, but hateful ideology, so they can identify, organized hate groups that perpetuate this kind of speech and worse, in particular that which calls for violence against particular communities. But of course, we know how slow they've been to deplatform those groups and individuals, how slow they are to respond to reports, if at all. I mean, we hear lots of stories of people reporting and not getting any feedback on that, how slow they are to exclude hateful speech. So again, plenty of pressure to be brought to bear there. I will say it was interesting to see after the murders in London just over a week ago that Facebook did take this step. They said there's absolutely no place on our platform for people who commit such horrendous acts. We've removed the suspect's Facebook account and designated the event as a terror attack, and will remove all content that praises or supports the perpetrator or the horrific act as soon as we are aware. Our investigation to date has not shown a link to hate groups or past violations of Facebook's community standards. And I think what's interesting is not just that they removed the suspect's account, but also, we're trying to identify and remove pieces that praise or support the perpetrator, because we were seeing an awful lot of that online after the event, as I mentioned earlier on, that those in organized hate groups, typically not on Facebook, but on some of the fringe platforms, absolutely were engaging in celebration, calling for additional similar behaviors, those sorts of things. And so had they been on Facebook, they could conceivably have been removed, but because they were on places like Telegram and Gab, there was very little that could be done. Twitter, very similar to Facebook in terms of their community standards. They identify both hateful conduct as well as, I think this is interesting, hateful imagery and display names, because there are often images, whether it's videos or whether it's cartoonish figures, that are also intended to vilify and dehumanize a particular group. So it's important that that's recognized as well, which it is in this particular context. As I say, Twitter has a very similar kind of policy there. I think we're spending time really on Twitter and Facebook because I think that's where so many of us, sort of in the mainstream, spend our time and our energy on social media. The same kinds of codes are typically associated with other kinds of platforms. But I think it's also important. Maybe we'll just stop here for a moment and talk a little bit more about additional platforms and about what hate looks like, what kinds of platforms we see it emerging in. And of course, obviously Facebook and Twitter, and all of those other mainstream pieces that we're involved with, perhaps even WhatsApp, for all that we're using that right now to have conversations within the working group. But then there are also all of these sort of fringe platforms: Gab, Telegram, Parler before it was completely taken down from the domain. And so this is where folks go, white supremacists in particular, and other sort of fringe movements go when they've been deplatformed. Now, the beauty of them going into these other directions is that most of us are not exposed to them. The problem is they continue to sort of foment hatred amongst themselves, which can exacerbate the problem. It can sort of reinforce and reaffirm their very negative messages amongst themselves. The problem is also that these are often encrypted and coded, so it's very difficult to monitor them as well, both from a research perspective, which is what I do, and from a law enforcement perspective. So in some respects, it's sort of better to have them visible, although we don't want to have to face it every day. So it's a real challenge in terms of how we connect there. There are other sorts of platforms and forms that the hate speech takes. So if we think about what it looks like, we talked earlier about what it looks like. Sometimes it's messages and threats directed towards particular individuals or organizations, so messages sent explicitly to them. Sometimes it's this broader narrative, as we would see in white supremacist websites, for example. And not only, sometimes it's in mainstream media as well. Things like rebel news, mainstream, extreme, they're sort of well to the right of the mainstream, but also gaming platforms. And here's something to be aware of, with I'm going to say youth, but it's not just youth that are on the gaming platforms, but there's some really horrific things that happen there as well. I mean, some of the games themselves are really racist and homophobic and misogynistic and everything else. But what's really of concern, what has become sort of a grooming space for the far right movement, are the chat rooms and those sorts of things that are associated with the gaming platforms, where people are lured into, increasingly problematic and dangerous games and increasingly problematic and dangerous communities that might not just be restricted to the gaming platform. There are music videos that do the same thing, that share those very negative messages in artistic ways, so that they've been problematic in terms of regulation as well. So hate speech, again, is not just, those direct statements, but a whole array of other forms of media as well. We talked about the limitations very often associated with the social media companies, especially regulating hate speech. So I want to get a sense and to share, for you to share with others, a sense of what your experiences have been online, who's reported incidents of what you understood to be online hate, what kind of response you got, if any. And then, your thoughts on how we can make social media companies more responsive in light of what I'm sure you're going to find is, sort of an unsatisfactory response. What kind of pressure can we bring to bear? What kind of messaging is necessary in that context? So again, I'm going to have Jasmine put you into your breakout rooms.
Great, thanks, Dr. Perry. So we'll be using Google Jamboard again for breakout room 2. But it'll just be a different link. And so I pasted link 2 to the chat. So just make sure you're on the right link when discussing the questions in the breakout rooms. Hi, Mark. Were you able to enter a breakout room?
You know what? I think I might have pushed the wrong button and exited or something. Can you put me back in? I think I was in number 4. Thank you very much.
Hi, Nahid. We're just in breakout rooms right now, so I'll move you into one of the breakout rooms. Welcome back. I think we're all in the main room right now.
Okay, great. Again, we won't necessarily speak to each of these individually, but just to get a sense of sort of the overview. And one mentions here, there's no record evidence of it. And this is something that, we're going to talk about in terms of how we respond to this individually, is making sure we have that evidence. No government oversight. Yeah, okay. No, go ahead. It's okay. Have reported, some people have reported. Leverage, yeah, that's good. Leverage with advocacy organizations, yeah, absolutely. Speak up, yep. Continue actively reporting to call, yep, to call them out. Yeah, good, thanks. Number 3. No follow-up, just big box. I mean, that's really, I think, a very common experience. Number 4. Tons of times, yeah, so that's good. I mean, you keep doing it. It feels like you're not getting a response, but keep doing it. And again, it's about documenting that, right? And those patterns. I think a lot of people sort of given up. Why would we bother? Not much sense. It's sort of like, we're reporting hate crime to law enforcement. Why bother? You feel like nothing happens. Only if it rises to the level of criminal behavior do you think something might be done. So yeah, again, a lot of frustration there. So thanks for that. We will go back to my screen now. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear from the experiences that people have had and from what we know from the research as well, and just broader public dialogue, that, we cannot simply regulate or legislate our way out of this problem, that it's, it's in some respects, it's also like whack-a-mole, right? If a group or an individual, is deplatformed, they may pop up in another form and engage in the same sorts of behavior. So I think that there's a lot that we can do individually and collectively to enhance our own safety, but also enhance your safety collectively as a community in terms of counter narratives and countering what you see online. And so this is really bringing us to the meat of our conversations today, and that is how we can engage in counter speech. And so I'm going to start again with another brief video that lays out some of the definitions and some of the strategies around that. So Jasmine, if you would go ahead and play that, please.
I'm Dr. Erin Marie Saltman, and I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. Well, we've come to a period where actually online and offline engagement are definitely linked together, but the way that that looks is obviously very different. So hate speech offline is very distinctive, whereas online hate speech becomes quite a big gray area. It's very hard to define, and also a lot more people can sometimes be incentivized to be more extreme online because they can have anonymous profiles. They feel like they're not having to say something in front of direct people. It feels more protected. So we do see more engagement in extremist rhetoric, sometimes online, that people would not necessarily say offline. Counterspeech is a term that's really only come about in the last few years. Just like counter-extremism as a sector, this is relatively new, especially for governments, but particularly for civil society. Counterspeech can also be called counter-narratives or even alternative narratives. Counter-speech doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative speech. What it means is any sort of pathway or route or project that is undermining extremist rhetoric. So that could be through a campaign, that could be offline through a protest or an initiative, it could be through a hashtag, and it's different types of ways of engaging and countering extremism online. Counterspeech, particularly now, is highly important because we're witnessing that the typical things that would work offline, such as censoring hate speech, editing out individuals, not allowing them to have public platform if they're hate preachers, people tend to find online platforms as a way of continuing this. And actually counterspeech is extremely effective when we get alternative voices engaging against extremism online, because the typical measures of trying to censor or filter extremist content simply aren't working. In essence, if you're using censorship, you're attacking a symptom instead of a cause. And also it's ineffective. We see the same video or same comment coming back over and over, and actually just countering that with credible voices, with civil society standing up against it, is much more powerful. So civil society has a crucial part to play in counter-extremism and in counter-speech online because they are the credible voice. A government voice or even the head of a tech sector is not actually what is credible. Peers are credible, former extremists, mothers, religious leaders all have a role to play in a very powerful voice. However, for a civil society individual, it can be quite intimidating to go and try to counter an extremist, which is not what I would ever ask anyone to do unless they really wanted to. I personally would not go on a KKK website and say, stop being racist. Actually, there's a lot of ways to engage in hashtags or be a part of larger movements that are really positive, that actually aren't directly attacking anything, but actually are just providing really positive alternatives that naturally undermine extremism. And everyone has a role to play in that.
Good, thanks for that, Jasmine. Yeah, so as you can see from what Erin's had to say here, what we're talking about in terms of counter speech are counter narratives and their strategies really intended to really to deflect some of the negative narratives that we see online, to de-escalate them, and to disempower those that that post them as well. So I think that we're really concerned with limiting the impact, limiting the credibility and the acceptance of those sorts of narratives, and it often means building alternative narratives in maybe a different space. So we think about discrediting those narratives that we read. That is by offering sort of alternative messages, but also, you know, concrete data, if you will, that counters those messages. You know, legitimate studies, legitimate research that that counters some of the narratives we might hear. That demystifies, I think, some of the messaging as well, especially when we're talking about, you know, those sorts of narratives that vilify particular communities, that play up stereotypes and misrepresentations of communities as well. How do you demystify those people who might not be known? I mean, this is what makes people susceptible very often to you know, those misrepresentations of Muslims, for example, is that they don't know Muslims themselves, right? They've never had contact. If we're in a, you know, a rural community in you know, Northern Ontario, chances are you've not met many Muslims. So, you know, how do we use the social media and other formats to challenge those stereotypes? A group of my students a few years back developed a website, for example, that shared stories of newcomers, many of whom were Muslims. So they were telling their own stories about, you know, why they came to Canada, their experiences here, sometimes the negative experiences, but often the positive experiences, about, you know, the reception, the very welcome reception that they had, or about, you know, the small business that they were able to create given the supports that were available here. So important to keep in mind that, you know, that what we're talking about here in terms of counter speech is actually a whole spectrum of strategies that we can use to intervene and to engage people around very negative, well, against those very negative narratives and around much more positive narratives as well. So at the outset, I think it's important to, you know, to recognize a few sorts of almost ground rules or caveats to keep in mind. And I think the most important one that I'm going to highlight here is that there are times when it's probably best not to engage or to disengage. If you've started to interact with someone who's posting something negative and they keep on, you know, it might be time to withdraw and move on. And so it's about safety. It's about, you know, giving them space and giving them the airtime that they desire. Sometimes it's best to just close down that conversation. But if you choose to, and if the environment is right, you know, there are a number of strategies that you can keep in mind with respect to how to do that at the individual level. And we'll talk about the collective level in a moment. I think the first thing is to be sure you're safe. Be sure that it's a safe environment in which you are engaging in this counter speech, whether it's online or offline. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those safety mechanisms in just a bit. And one of those is one set of those revolves around your online identity and being sure before you start to engage here that your online identity is secure, that you know, people can't use information that's online to dox you or to expose you to additional, you know, a threat or narratives, whatever the case may be. So I think safety first is the bottom line there. I think also before you begin to engage, you need to think about what it is that you're trying to do. You know, who is the audience that you're speaking to? Is it the poster and their audience or their like-minded others? Is it the individual of the community that's being targeted in that respect? Is it the broader audience? Is it the broader community, and you're trying to shape or reshape their understanding of, in this case, obviously, Muslim community and Islam generally. So think about what your goal is, because that might shape the way that you intervene, whether it's with the poster or whether it's the individual or community being targeted. And I think this is something that comes up again and again when we look at resources talking about counter speech and online engagement, and that, you know, the responses should be positive, right? Not negative, not name calling, not vilification of the other. It's sort of, you know, the golden rule: do unto others. And trying to remember that however odious the words are, however hateful the words are, however damaging, there's a human being there somewhere. And I think that, you know, very often engaging, and some people's our immediate reaction often is to lash out in anger and to name call, or, you know, to vilify that person. And I think that only exacerbates the problem. Better to disengage than engage in that kind of behavior and dialogue. And this is, sort of speaks to the first message here, that is staying calm. That is, thank you, my tea has just been delivered. Thanks for that. That staying calm again, and that is, if you do feel the anger level rising, then that is the time to step down, not to engage, because then it's sort of an online shouting match, and it's not typically very productive. The second one, asking questions. This is something when someone says, how do I just in general, how do I communicate? How do I talk with someone who holds these sorts of ideas, whether they're xenophobic or anti-Muslim or anti-gay? And my response is always to ask questions, not to lecture, not to talk down to someone, but to ask some questions. How did you get there? Why do you believe that? Where did you get that information? That sort of thing. And that's engagement. That's dialogue. That's not, again, shouting someone down. So I think that's, a really important place to begin. But again, at what point do you have to disengage, because they're just escalating in some response, in some respects. Try humor sometimes if we're thinking about de-escalation, right? To not, to sort of make light of the issue. And again, that's about de-escalation and disempowering, right? The impact of the commentary. If you make light of it and then move on to something else. So it's also about distraction that we'll talk about in just a moment. Again, labeling the comment and not the person. Don't engage in those ad hominem attacks. That is most likely to exacerbate the problem. Show empathy and connection to the target. So this is about reaching out again. We got to remember that there's often two sides here. There is the person who is posting the hateful language, but then there's the person or the organization or the community that is being targeted. And this is where we can show real allyship in terms of finding points of connection there, finding positive points of connection, and showing that sense of empathy or shared experience, if you will. And this is something that we hear a lot of, and I think that Aaron talked about it in the video as well, is start a supportive hashtag, or finding other ways, right, to support the target in terms of the likes and the shares on their social media platform, and even again these hashtags that have very positive as opposed to negative images. And then the don'ts, it's sort of the obverse of that. A lot of what I've been talking about already in terms of the labeling and the name calling and the very negative responses. Again, we always want to think in positive terms rather than negative. The second one here I think is very important and speaks to something that I think comes up a little bit later. And don't assume the person has bad intentions. I think we have to distinguish between misinformation and disinformation that people post. I mean, often people will post misinformation, stuff that they firmly believe is to be true. It's something, a piece of information or, a report that's been passed on to them. And they very acritically accept it. That's very different than disinformation, which is explicitly intended, right, to provide false information. Whether that's about a community or whether it's about COVID or the vaccine, whatever the case. So, I think and this is, can come through that question, asking questions, right? How people came to those opinions. I've already talked about the not being hostile, not talking down. This next one seems obvious, right? Don't nitpick, don't focus on the spelling and grammar, because that too, can be taken as an affront. And don't silence the person. You can ghost them and not engage, but that's a very different strategy. There are a whole array of guidelines. This is just, a really quick and dirty introduction. There are a whole array of resources online that can help you to think about your own safety, to think about, how to engage in these kinds of counter narratives, provide some scripts in certain contexts, that sort of thing. So, I encourage you to do some surfing and find some of them. This one in particular is one that we're using here in terms of safety, in particular, Empowering Internet Safety Guide for Women. A safety guide, you can see the website there. If you just Google Empowering Internet Safety Guide for Women, you'll find it that way as well. And so we've just taken a few, just again, coming back to Facebook and Twitter, and it's very similar in both respects in terms of how you maintain your own safety. If you're going to choose to engage online, this almost should have been first, right? It's important that you are, you ensure that you are safe, that you have built in, all of the safety mechanisms that you can. And that's one thing social media companies are doing is increasing the control that you have very often over your platform. So controlling exactly who sees what in terms of who you friend. You can decide to take people down, obviously, to unfriend them at any moment, right? To take them to block them from access to your website. So make sure those privacy settings are set to ways that you're comfortable with. If you are experiencing these sorts of issues, then you might want to revisit them and see if there are even more stringent strategies that you can use. Never identify, to the best you can, don't identify, sort of where you are, specific location, that sort of thing. Especially if you've been having this experience, right? Someone that is trolling you or someone that is following you with not positive intentions, if you will. So, one recommendation, if you're at the Oshawa Beach, what's it called? I can't remember, Parkview. If you're at the beach down in Oshawa, don't say, here we are right now at 1 o'clock. But maybe at the end of the day, then you post and say, hey, we were down there. Here's a photo, that sort of thing. So limiting the amount of geographical information you include. So for example, myself, and this can be sort of what you post there, but even when I do media interviews, often, if I'm out of town, I just always say Oshawa, because folks know the interviews in Oshawa. So I just always say, regardless of where I am, that's where I am, so that people aren't trying to find me in other locations. The third one is, very much like the first one, blocking people, even if it's only short term, but certainly blocking those who are being most offensive and causing the most problems for you. Reporting imposter accounts. So that's sort of both sides. I mean, there are people who will attempt to claim your identity online and, will try to engage with your friends, posting, very inappropriate messages that make you look like, make you look like a racist, or make you look like, a homophobe, or make you look like anti-Semitic. If you become aware of that, obviously report them right away. The other sorts of imposter accounts are just those that are shut down and they pop up with another identity, and you can often tell because it's the same kind of narrative, it's the same kind of voice that they're using in their posts. So those need to be reported right away. Facebook, and I think Twitter to some extent as well, but Facebook specifically, it does have some rules and regulations around that. Again, the extent to which it's imposed is a different thing. And the other is preventing revenge porn. There's not much you can do to prevent that. Obviously, don't have naked pictures taken, but that doesn't mean that's going to stop someone, right? They can superimpose your face on any image. I mean, the technology is so powerful now that there's little you can do to prevent it. But of course, again, you can report that. We talked about those controls. These are just the step-by-step ways to move through that. Again, I think that's those guidelines are you can access them on your phone at any time, or on your device at any time. The help guide, if you will, that helps you to figure out how to block, how to enhance your privacy. Your privacy settings, and the geotagging as well. So yeah, again, you can find that fairly easily. Safety on Twitter, not that much different than on Facebook. Same kind of rules: reporting and blocking abusers. Don't provide the geographical information. Multiple profiles, so a professional profile perhaps that has a different group of friends or those who can access, maybe a separate personal one, different profiles for different pieces of your life. Prevent doxing. I think that most of us know now what doxing is, and that is really using your personal information, gathering your personal information off online and using it against you in some way, and to steal your identity, to leave you vulnerable to attacks. So, for example, when I was doing some of the work around right-wing extremism out west, I remember there was a group of anti-racists who were being, in an ongoing way, being doxxed by far-right groups and individuals to the extent of posting their name, their address, and photographs even of their houses, and then saying, this is where they live, go get them. Incredibly dangerous. I mean, that can be reported not just to Twitter, to Facebook, but also to law enforcement. So I always keep that avenue in mind as well. So prevent doxing. And this is, you can Google yourself what's up there online that you might not be aware of. I found out after we started working in the area of far-right extremism and became very public in the media, one of my research assistants says, you might want to look online. There's still one of my resumes was still floating that had my address and telephone number on it. So, I got in touch with our IT department, and they managed to have it taken. They searched and found all the locations and took them down. So I think it's important that we know what's available out there publicly about us, and anything that provides information we don't want disclosed, get it taken down right away. And there are companies that will do that for you. So I think that's a really important starting point. And preventing hackers from taking over your Twitter account. So that's kind of like the what do we call it? The imposter accounts that I was referring to earlier on. So same kind of strategies there. Again, it's about your privacy settings and reporting those kinds of violations. As with Facebook, obviously there are concrete steps in terms of setting all of those privacy mechanisms on Twitter, and these are the steps involved there. Again, you can find that on the Twitter site and many other places as well, even just Googling how to set privacy settings on Twitter. One of the things that we hadn't talked much about, I sort of alluded to it on the way through, is this whole question of fake news, disinformation. And the conspiracy theories that are so rampant now. I mean, we're seeing them pop up around, they sort of started with QAnon conspiracy theories, but have certainly expanded beyond that. We see them around COVID. We see them around, oh gosh, we saw them 2-3 years ago at the height of what was called the refugee crisis. Fake news about, who was coming across the border, the US-Canada border, those sorts of pieces. And even the numbers, right, were misreported there. So just want, before we move on, talk a little bit about fake news, what that looks like, why we're vulnerable, how it is we're vulnerable to fake news, and what we can do to respond to that, identify it actually, and not fall prey to the fake news. So again, I'm going to ask Jasmine to share the video.
This might be Canada's most persistent piece of fake news. It comes from a 2004 letter to the editor printed in the Toronto Star. It says refugees in Canada receive more money from the government than retired citizens. It's not true. In fact, a retired Canadian is eligible for about double what a refugee gets, depending on the province. But you can still find the falsehood circulating online, even though the Star and the Canadian government debunked it. You should also know that Jagmeet Singh is not wanted for terrorism in 15 countries. Nor did the mayor of Dorval, Quebec, stand up to Muslim families who asked to take pork off school menus. He didn't do that. They never asked. And this website that looks like a local Quebec news site, it's actually an advertising revenue scheme based in Ukraine. All of this fake news seems to unravel with just a little bit of digging. So why do people keep falling for it, and how can you better spot it? First, let's get clear about the definition.
This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period.
Fake news has been used to describe everything from political spin to pranks to conspiracy theories, even to media outlets politicians don't like.
You are fake news.
I like real news, not fake news. You're fake news.
The fake news, the enemy of the people.
That's why researchers say we should stop using those words and instead say misinformation or disinformation. They define disinformation as the deliberate creation or sharing of false information to mislead people. Misinformation is the act of sharing information without realizing it's wrong. Whether it's a headline designed to sway opinions, make money, or it's simply just misconstrued, sharing this stuff can have real consequences. Misleading social posts shared in 2017 encouraged Haitian asylum seekers to try and cross into Canada from the US. WhatsApp messages like this one said Canada had invited all Haitian nationals in the US to apply for residency. It wasn't true, but for people facing possible deportation back to Haiti, it was something they wanted to hear. Researchers say there are a ton of reasons people share fake news. Some are just sharing stuff that they agree with. Some are deliberately making trouble. Others just don't know what they're sharing is false.
I do research on human reasoning and decision making. I research essentially the science of human stupidity.
Gordon Pennycook says social media platforms prime people to be, quote, lazy thinkers.
Mostly it's just, pictures of dogs and babies and and things like that. And you might come across a news article, but you're not really in the sort of mode that you ought to be in when you're engaging with actual news content.
Among other things, his research looked at the effect of repeat exposure.
We basically showed people fake news headlines in the format that they would be on social media. And what we showed is that a single prior exposure to a fake news headline increases later belief in that headline, regardless of whether the person remembers having seen it before.
Now consider the convincing nature of a video clip. Check out this moment between Prime Minister Trudeau and Brazil's President Bolsonaro at the G20. Clips of it started circulating online with partisan groups saying it showed a, quote, awkward and pathetic Trudeau being snubbed on the world stage. Global News tried to clarify the disinformation by tweeting a longer version of the video showing that the two men did in fact shake hands. But you'll notice that the correct information didn't spread as far as the disinformation, and that, experts will tell you, is what's wrong with social media.
Ultimately, it's calibrated for engagement so that the more people are enraged and engaged and ultimately divided on these sites, the more they use them and the more they post and the more they share, which is ultimately good for the platforms and the business model of the platforms.
Taylor Owen studies the political impact of digital technology at McGill University. He says people should be skeptical of content that makes them angry, especially during an election year.
Pipelines, reconciliation, immigration, these things that we already know are in the popular debate, how are they being amplified? How are they being torqued by people trying to divide us against each other?
So what else can you do to prevent falling for disinformation? Well, be skeptical of what you see online. Read the whole article. Sometimes that sensational headline doesn't match the body of the story. Ask yourself, is the author or organization familiar to you? Are they reputable? Are other reputable outlets reporting the story too? Look at the URL. If the content is imitating a legitimate site, the branding might match, but the URLs won't. If you really want to dig, try a Google reverse image search of photos in the story. And if you see something that's fake or misleading, report it to the platform you saw it on. But here's the problem. Not everyone has the time, skill, or will to do this kind of sleuthing.
It's not just not knowing that much about the world. It's not like ignorance. It's just not being kind of that willing to think about things, which is a different sort of stupidity.
So what's the solution? Well, there's no single easy answer.
Fact-checking has the potential to be a really helpful and powerful medium. So holding politicians to account for the incorrect things that they say.
Jason Reifler studies public opinion and political psychology at the University of Exeter in the UK. He says news organizations, journalists, and social media platforms all have a role in preventing the spread of disinformation, but studies show little things you do can help too.
And on an individual level basis, calling our friends and relatives out in a nice, not into what starts as a huge political argument, but just pointing out when they're saying things that aren't correct, but that can have a beneficial effect.
As the world gets bigger and more connected, we need that sense of intimacy more than ever.
Facebook says it's employed fact checkers and moderators and will take down accounts that try to interfere with the election. Plus, governments around the world have been turning up the pressure on companies like Facebook to do more.
The platforms are failing their users.
Canada has also signaled it's considering penalties for tech platforms that don't clamp down on disinformation.
And if they don't, we will hold them to account, and there will be meaningful financial consequences.
But they haven't acted specifically on that. Want to know more about human behavior and fake news? Ask us about our resources and sources in the comments.
Okay, yeah, so again, that sort of highlighted what I was saying about the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. I think this has become an incredible, it's difficult to tell the difference. I think one of them is often the commentary perhaps that's attached to something that's tweeted or forwarded or shared online. I think you really have to, sort of look at the context to know which is the case. And sometimes, well, I was going to say, sometimes it's easier to engage and to question, friends and family who post something that you think, they're simply confused. They're simply, not being reflective. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, but I think this is where the whole question of critical digital literacy comes into play, and it's something that I really highlight the importance of our ability to reflect on what it is that we're reading, what it is that's coming across our screens. I think that we tend to be very acritical about what's shared with us and just pass it on, pass it on to the next person. I remember reading just a few months ago about somebody who was developing an app that you would use. It's not something that would be imposed, but you would use, if you wanted to, I guess, sort of identify for yourself, what was coming across your screens, that it would read the messages that were coming across and raise a red flag if it appeared to be misinformation or disinformation, just so you would take a moment to reflect, to pause, to reflect, maybe to engage in some of these strategies for spotting fake news and responding to fake news and disinformation, misinformation. So I think these really break down. I'm not going to read every one of them. You will be getting these slides in the not too distant future. But I think they really break down into two pieces. One is, identifying, what are some of the red flags? What are some of the things that we should look for in terms of, things that should make us question that this doesn't feel quite right. And there are a whole array of sort of technical pieces there in terms of the all caps or Photoshops or the domain, if the domain name doesn't look quite right, those sorts of things. But the other half of it is really about how do you fact check, right? So doing your research. You have a sense that something's not quite right. Some of the images, some of the stories that started out that video, how do you double check that, right? How do you sort of check that gut response that you had, and a whole array of strategies in terms of and I think there were some examples in the video as well about how you can check the images, how you can check the stories, You know, how widely is this being reported? Can you find it in the mainstream, or is it just something in the fringe? Those sorts of pieces. I think one of my favorite examples was the Trudeau handshake. I think that one was very clever and really did make him look horribly bad. But what was interesting, again, as they said, right, is the extent to which that was shared. So I think that's maybe the third piece, right, is once you've identified something as being, you know, disinformation, then how can you also you know, spread that word and warn people about what's being spread. So yeah, I thought it was just important to include this piece on fake news, given the conspiracy theories we're seeing and the disinformation associated with them. So now I want to turn to some more concrete ways that you can intervene in terms of individual responses to hate speech, disinformation, fake news, you know, each of these pieces, but really the focus on those negative narratives that we might confront. So whether it's targeted as you or whether you're a bystander and observing all of those pieces. So again, keep in mind that this is all really about de-escalation and about disempowering the person who is doing the posting as well. And I will add a fifth D, and that's sort of in the next slide, and that is documenting. It's something I mentioned earlier on, and so we will talk about that as well. And the first strategy here is, you know, sort of that direct response, and it's not just directly to the perpetrator, right? That engagement. You might want to engage with them, you know, keeping all those caveats in mind that we talked about earlier on. You might want to counter their narrative with something else. So, you know, you can, yes, stop. You know, we're not listening to that. That's not something that, you know, that is appropriate on this format, on this platform, whatever it might be. But in particular, it's about, you know, disempowering the perpetrator, but empowering the person who, or the community that's being targeted, right? So engaging with them directly. Right? Do they need help? Do they need support? You know, if it's you know, if they feel like there's been a threat, do you need someone to come and to escort you or to be with you, or, you know, to ensure your safety? So that direct response, I think that's where, you know, particularly, I mean, the direct response to the perpetrator is stop, but I think that more direct response in terms of offering the support is probably, especially when it is devolving into something as serious as threats, and there's a real risk there. So that direction is really important. And this is where you might also, you know, engage in the sorts of behaviors we were mentioning earlier on in terms of sending positive messages in support of the individual or the community. You know, those positive hashtags, the shares, the likes, all of those sorts of pieces. Again, in a way that empowers the target and disempowers the perpetrator. Distracting, it is what it says, right? That is distract the perpetrator. So change the subject matter or give them something else to think about, maybe in the same context, but you know, providing a post or a link to you know, another kind of messaging, but also disrupt, turn away online, virtually, from the perpetrator and focus on the person who is being targeted. So again, it takes the power away from the perpetrator to define the terms of the conversation. You're turning instead to the individual and, you know, again, maybe something completely off topic, but engaging them in a different kind of conversation or dialogue. So you're changing the focus, removing the focus from those very negative messages to something more positive and productive in terms of a dialogue between yourself and the target. Delegate, right? Don't think that you're in this alone. Don't think that you have to do all of the labor. And in fact, the more people that you can bring into the conversation in positive ways, the more effective that will be. So if there are other, if you're on Facebook and there are other friends in your Facebook network circle that, share your views, bring them in to engage in that alternative conversation. If you have people in your network that are, professionals in the field, perhaps can provide, some sort of support for the target, right? If they're really not, well, maybe traumatized, they could be traumatized, but if they're really affected emotionally, are there counselors, are there psychiatrists, psychologists in your network that might be able to support them? So delegate some of that. Another way of delegating, of course, is to report to the social media provider for all of its limitations. But also, keep in mind that often hate speech online does rise to the level of criminal behavior. So, engage law enforcement as well. Don't be afraid to report hate speech online to law enforcement. At the very least, there's a record of it. So if it escalates, you've got that record. That comes back to the documentation we'll talk about in a moment. So law enforcement, the hate crime officers, particularly and folks in diversity, will tell you it's important to be able to document these, it might not rise to the criminal level of criminal code, but hate incidents should also be reported. Again, it's about creating that chain so that, heaven forbid, it should escalate. There is that evidence, there is that documentation. And you may have to delay, or you may choose to delay a response. So you might just shut down and completely disengage from the conversation if it's started to escalate, encourage others to also shut down and not engage, but then reach out, to the target later on. Reach out to provide support. Are you okay? Just check in, make sure that they're okay. Remind them of the kinds of services. This is one of the reasons that we provide at the end. At the end of the 4 series of workshops, we will provide these slides, we'll provide these resources so that you can pass them on, right? Pass these on to individuals who are being targeted, to organizations that are being targeted as well, so that they also know what some of the strategies are for intervening and for shutting down that kind of threatening engagement. And then finally, document. And this is something I've talked about before. Keep a log of, keep a log of when these sorts of things have happened. What the name of the individual is. If it's available, even if it's the, if it's a handle, or an imposter, you think it's an imposter. Keep that record. Take screenshots so that you've got that documentary evidence as well. Someone talked earlier on about, unfortunately, we don't have the evidence. Make sure you do, right? Keep screenshots of this, keep screenshots of the responses you get from social media platforms, social media companies if you report, so that you do have that, all of that documentation. You do have what you need to take a case forward should the need arise. Okay, so we talked about these 5 Ds, the distraction. What were they? Direct, distract, delegate, and delay, and document. So I'm going to show you now a screenshot of a post. And I am going to warn you. So if you feel like you might be triggered, perhaps you want to step away at this point. It's a very strong anti-Muslim statement that we're going to share with you, but this is the reality. This is what people and individuals and organizations are facing. So I want you to think now about those 5 Ds we just talked about, and how might they be useful in this example? How might you employ these strategies? What would that look like? What kind of language? What kind of advice would you give to others in this kind of context? Who would you bring into the conversation? So again, I will turn it over to Jasmine to get you into your groups.
Great. So I'll paste the new link for this Jamboard into the chat. So make sure you're using the correct link. And I'll move folks to the room now. Hi there, were you able to enter a breakout? Okay.
So Jasmine, did you let all of the groups know how to get to it?
Yes, I broadcasted a message to the breakout rooms, and I pasted the comments onto the second slide of the Jamboard.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, I think, are we all back, Jasmine?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, this was a little harder, right? This was, you know, what would you do? Thinking a hypothetical is often very difficult, and that was a challenging one, I think, to respond to, the one that we shared. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, you would report to Facebook. You would document, and I really appreciate the documentation in particular, right? That screenshot, as we've done here, right? We have that screenshot. Now, if this escalates, if it continues, then you know you continue to document in that respect. The next one. Never a good idea to respond. Very good. Yeah. So again, using the distraction as opposed to that direct engagement, perhaps the distraction. Share information, really good. Provide information that's a common ground. Yeah. Cause for more hate. Counter narrative. Yeah, I like that. The positive, you know, the positive messaging. And again, you know, in that respect, it might not be, the intent might not be to challenge the individual, but to share with the broader audience, you know, some alternative representations of the Muslim community. So I like that. We have, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, very good. Yeah. So again, questioning rather than sort of accusing or you know, engaging. Just ignore it. Yep. Distract. I like that. I like, yeah, that distraction is really good because again, it takes the power away from them. They're not leading the conversation anymore. Yep. Don't respond. Good. Yep. Good. That was the last one, I guess, right? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I think that you got the message loud and clear that you know, that not engaging is often as effective as engaging. And when you're engaging, it's as much about engaging the broader audience as it is the individual who is posting. So I really appreciate that. Really well done there. Okay, so I think we'll just take another quick 10 minutes here for a bit of a bio break. I'm sure some of you have been stepping away to get yourself a cup of tea. As you saw, I have my tea so nicely delivered to me. But just a few minutes here for you to get up, stretch your legs, and come back. I said 10. Let's say 7 minutes. Okay, so I've got 1:16. So let's say at 1:23 we will begin again. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Barbara, sorry to intervene, but you know, that question or the post came from our social media campaign that we had, the Dare to Be Aware campaign last year. We got a lot of hate trolls and messaging in response to an anti-hate campaign, which was interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, thanks for that context.
I just wanted to ask, will you be sharing all the slides and the videos that you presented today?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the whole series of workshops, all of the materials, the slides, the resources that we've included, all of that will come to you.
Thank you.
And that is closer to August. So our series ends in end of July. And so August, we are holding focus groups where we hope to bring some of you together. And that's where we'll be sharing and emailing it to the others.
Okay, well, I'm going to assume everyone's back now. You've got your cup of tea in hand and ready to move forward. We're sort of in the home stretch now. So we've talked about sort of the background and the context, what online hate looks like. We've talked about the way that as individuals you can respond and develop counter narratives. We're going to finish with sort of ways to strategize collectively in this space. But before we move on, I just wonder if there are any questions that people have, and you can go ahead and put them in the chat if you like.
Yes, Dr. Perry, I do have one on my end. So we were talking about, reporting hate online earlier. And there was like a conversation about how a lot of the times you report, a hate comment on social media, and there isn't really much that's done afterwards. You don't really see any, impact, or sometimes even if something does get taken down, they're allowed to come back online and continue, whatever they were doing previously. So some people were wondering if there are other ways you can report online hate other than just using the platforms where the hate is being spread.
Yeah, good question. I think that, even on those platforms, one strategy with the platforms is sort of a collective action. So it's not just an individual reporting that, that one perpetrator, but if you can build a coalition, a number of people that are reporting the same person, I think that gives it some weight. But aside from that, as I mentioned, you can also, you can report it to, there are a few third-party reporting mechanisms now. National Council of Canadian Muslims has a reporting mechanism. Some provinces have the same sort of thing. I know Alberta does now. I don't think we have one in Ontario. And you can report it to law enforcement. Again, as I mentioned, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a criminal code violation, especially in those services, that larger services that have a hate crime unit, they're very happy to take the reports of bias incidents as well. So language that might feel threatening, but sort of legally doesn't reach that standard. So you can report it there, and again, nothing might happen, but there is the documentation so that you can make a case moving forward. If the social media companies aren't responding to those kinds of incidents in particular, there's not much else that can be done to change it aside from continuing to challenge and to push back, both with the perpetrator and with the company. But I think that there's a point at which law enforcement can be mobilized as well. And again, you're most likely to have luck where there is a hate crime unit, and again, sadly, that's largely only in urban areas. And so, when you contact police, ask to be engaged with the hate crime unit or with the diversity team, and sort of don't just report through the traditional mechanisms. Keep pushing it.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to mention, Krista, I put it in the chat, but Krista mentioned that the Coalition of Muslim Women in Kitchener-Waterloo has developed a website, reportinghate.ca, for this purpose locally.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's a really good model to set. I really appreciate that. And hopefully others can follow through on that. Great job. Thank you for that. That's it for now?
Yeah, that's it for now.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully we'll have time at the end for other questions that might arise. All right, so we are going to talk about collective counter speech, and that's essentially creating campaigns, if you will, intended to counter hate, building coalitions. Now, some of you, don't think it was a large proportion, but some of you are already part of the CCMW. So, maybe within that context, as we saw with the reporting mechanism, the local chapter might engage in this. Maybe you're part of another community-based organization that can be a part of building out a strategy, a local strategy, if you will. And if not, you can build up a coalition of people who share your interest in really effectively countering the hate speech that's so prevalent online. And so again, there are multiple ways you can go about this. There are a lot of sort of supportive strategies out there. This one we've derived from a European project actually called We Can, Taking Action Against Hate Speech Through Counter and Alternative Narratives. So again, you will get this resource later in the year, so that you can flip through it. But for now, if you just Google Taking Action Against Hate Speech Through Counter you should be able to find it as well. But this is just, sort of very loosely, very easily manageable, I think, the kinds of steps that you want to take towards developing some sort of campaign, whether it's offline or online. Just because the speech is online doesn't mean that it only needs to be addressed online. I had for, I think, 3 different semesters, groups of students developing counter narratives and counter strategies for responding to online hate specifically. And they actually had combinations of online and offline pieces. So they developed websites, or they developed interactive websites, in fact, where people could post their stories about their own experiences of racism or about their positive experiences. I mentioned earlier the one that one group of students did that was developing a space for newcomers to share their stories, to put a human face to those communities. So they had the online component, but some of them also developed offline components. So on campus, for example, they did some tabling. So for I think it was a couple of weeks at a go, they had a table in the space, one of the spaces that students sort of pass by on a daily basis, on a regular basis, in fact, throughout the day, with information. I'm trying to think what that one was specifically about. I think it was sort of very broadly defined, countering hate. So they had information about what hate speech looked like, and they had information about, how to report the sorts of things that we had here, how to be safe. So, kind of like this, only just in written form, that students could take away to ensure their own safety or their community safety, if you will. We had another one that developed a curriculum, a workshop curriculum for high school students, grade 10 and 11 students, that outlined what far-right extremism was, what the dynamics of the groups looked like, what their ideologies were, what their recruitment strategies were, all of those pieces. And I think they delivered it to about a dozen classes in Durham region, in our region here. And so that was very effective as an online component. So again, you can take this online or offline, or have a blended approach, right? So you've got a little bit of each. Of course, in the context of COVID, the online mechanism is obviously going to be most effective. But the steps are pretty straightforward. I think it's it's intuitive, and the assessment is that's the foundation. That's the starting point. This is really the background report. Excuse me. This is, an examination of the issue at hand. If we're talking about hate speech, anti-Muslim hate speech specifically, what are some of the platforms? What's the nature of the speech? Who's posting? What's the audience? What's the intended audience? What is, talk here the geographical and temporal distribution, but also what's the response that that speech is getting in terms of likes and shares and all of that sort of thing. So it's really getting the lay of the land, right? What is the issue? What is the issue that you are exploring, and what are the contours of it? How many people are involved? What are the locations? Again, what are the main platforms or venues that folks are using in that context? And I think that's really important, especially if you're going to be seeking funding for developing these sorts of programs. And I should add here that this is one of my big hopes. If there's anything positive to have come out of what the Muslim communities experienced in the last few weeks, I think it is that hopefully, finally, we will see some concrete action and support for Muslim communities and Muslim community organizations. So the Public Safety Canada, the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, excuse me, does already have considerable funding for developing programs intended to counter hate, including online hate. So that's one fund. Heritage Canada, obviously, has funding for that. And one hopes that we'll see more of that rolling out, that will be attached to, the rejuvenated National Action Plan against racism and the promised action against Islamophobia. So, watch for those opportunities and, have that background piece in place, because that's always part of it. Why is this project important? What demonstrate the need for the project? So that's sort of the starting point. And then, of course, the design, obviously, and this is laying out clearly your aims and your objectives, what it is you hope to achieve, who you hope to target, right? What is the audience? There are those at the fringe, there are those at the extreme that, you're not going to convince them. You're not going to change their minds. What we're interested in is that mushy middle, that apathetic middle ground, people who, sort of aren't paying attention, don't recognize the extent of the problem, but are nonetheless consumers of those online narratives. I think that that's the most likely target audience. Or it might be, the target audience might be, the broader Muslim community, people who are being affected. It might in fact be a means of supporting them and empowering the community rather than responding to the hate itself in a direct way. So helping to build resilience within the community. So the design obviously is about the nuts and the bolts, right? What are you going to embed? What kinds of strategies are you embedding there? What media are you using? Is it online only? Is it offline? Is it only through Facebook? You have multiple social media platforms that you're going to deploy in this sort of context. And then, of course, the action plan, which brings you to the implementation. And I think that the most important point here in some context, well, maybe 2 and 3, but especially number 2, engaging with the media. That is promoting the initiative, promoting the program. It does very little good if it just sort of sits in that social media shell and you haven't, done a press release, or you haven't engaged local media and demanded an interview and a conversation about the work that you're doing. So you need to obviously distribute it through social media, but don't forget traditional media as well, right? The good old-fashioned radio, good old-fashioned television and newspapers. So I think you have to think broadly in terms of the promotion. Consider influential people that will also help you promote, or that might be featured, if you're doing narratives, you're doing videos, those sorts of things. But think back to one of the earlier videos when they talked about, and I think that was in the first video, where she talked about, excuse me, think very carefully about who those are, that in fact politicians are not necessarily the right people, that and then often depends on your audience. For youth, you want someone youthful. You want someone that they might respect, or that they might want to emulate, a professional athlete, for example, or a musician, a popular musician. So who is most influential for the audience, target audience that you are talking about, if you are going to feature people like that. So those are very careful selections, I think, that need to be made. And that broad engagement as well, not just a handful of people, creating the strategy and the implementation plan, but it should be fairly broad-based, in terms of ages, in terms of the sort of cultural, ethnic diversity, gender diversity of the folks that you bring in, people who are normally disengaged from these conversations, bring them in. So think about who the affected communities and individuals are, and have them as part of the strategy as well. The 5th piece is really important, and that's a part that's often forgotten and left out in in developing any kind of strategy, and that is the evaluation. Now with a funder, you'll be required to build that in, so that makes it easier to remember. But I think it's always important at the outset to define quite concretely where you want to be and how you're going to measure whether you've achieved that or not. Because this, if you want it to be sustainable, it needs to be a living project as well. You need to be able to identify the gaps and methodically identify the gaps and the strengths and build from there. So you're going to want to sort of get that sort of ongoing feedback from participants or the audience, whoever it may be. If it's online, you want to monitor the metrics in terms of likes and shares and all of that sort of thing. Be creative in terms of how you assess that impact. So these are sort of the basic building blocks. Just want to give you a few examples of some campaigns that we've seen developing and emerging over the past few years. This one is Extreme Dialogue. It is Canadian based, and it's a really interesting one because it is about storytelling. And it's a whole series of videos. I mean, they do other things as well. They do engage directly with people who are affected, both in terms of being recruited into far-right groups, but also being targeted very often. So storytelling here through videos, and some very powerful videos from people who have been sort of on both sides of the equation of hate, both as targets, both as perpetrators and as victims. So this, along with several other groups like this, actually feature people who are former far-right extremists who are now doing this kind of work, this anti-hate work, how they, sort of what's their life trajectory, and what are lessons learned there, but also people who have been affected by racism, by homophobia, by Islamophobia, right, who have been on the other side of that equation. So again, as with the example I was telling you about my students, sharing stories of both, the negative experiences people have had, but also the positive experiences in a way that empowers affected communities. And another one, Artist Combats Online Hate. So this is an individual who, messages through their art, again, both their experiences, but also messages of hope, messages of love, as opposed to messages of hate, intended to support their community. This one I think we're very familiar with, and some of you mentioned that you've been on the website already, and you can see how broadly based this is. That it's not just the workshops, but there are a whole array of other resources as well. It's an incredible point of contact for people who might be experiencing online or offline hate. So again, I think fairly widely known. It's been well promoted, I think, within the Muslim community specifically. And of course, these workshops are part of that. As is this series of posters and images, which are shared online, but I think I understand correctly, offline as well. So these can be, you can put these up in your workplace when you ever go back to your workplace. But again, just highlighting those messages. I mean, these are things that if you have them in the workplace, people see them every day, and after a while, it does become their truth as well. Campaign toolkit, we've mentioned as we've gone along some cool toolkits along the way for different things, for online safety, for developing counter narratives, all of that kind of thing. And this is one toolkit for helping you, I think it just in general terms, not just about online hate, but as a toolkit to help you think about some of those strategies that we talked about before, the ADIE. What does that look like in practice? So again, another good resource for not so much the messaging as it is for the strategies or the how-to in terms of building out a campaign. Media Smarts has been with us now for many years. I'm not sure when they started, but I feel like I've been aware of them for forever. considerable exaggeration there, but it's, you know, it's sort of media monitoring, both traditional media and social media, in terms of you know, identifying problematic misrepresentations of communities and facts generally. So it's not, you know, it's not just about hate, but about other forms of disinformation and misinformation. So monitoring that, but also providing strategies and resources for pushing back against that. They do a lot of community organizing. They do a lot of seminars and webinars and workshops in this area as well. So, you know, that might be as a local chapter, you might want to get a speaker in to guide you and help you think about the issues very concretely. So that's another example. Again, you know, many examples of campaigns and strategies intended to counter hate. And that more or less does it in terms of content. We do have a couple of pieces left, but before we move to our closing material and comments, I just wonder if there are any questions anyone wants to raise about any of the pieces that we've talked about today. And not just questions for me, but also questions for the organizers about the campaign itself, or about the work that CCMW does.
Barbara, I think I'm going to direct this question. This is Nazat. Direct this question to Firdaus. So, do you remember that post that we were looking at that was in response to our Dare to Be Aware or Dare campaign? And someone said, "Did you report that?" And I don't think we did. We chose not to even respond to it because it was just so vile. But Firdaus, do you remember whether we reported it or not? I didn't recall that we did, but we chose not to respond to it.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent question, Nuzat, because you know, we had a small team that were monitoring. So we had a 10-week social media campaign called Dare to Be Aware. It was on from last October till December. And every week we kind of brought out one illustration that spoke about hate or racism, but in a different context. So it could be at a workplace, dealing with immigration or refugee status, housing. So, you know, bringing out the different sectors where racism does exist. And we were quite surprised that, you know, with the support that we got through the campaign or through the 10 weeks, we also got a lot of hate and a lot of trolls, you know, people not understanding the campaign, but in a very aggressive way, you know, demeaning the campaign, etc. And what we did was we kind of were a little strategic because we you know, our campaign or the project is about hate. So we didn't want to counter it with negativities, but we kind of slowly through our inner team, who are also members of Facebook and the different social media, we used to slip in the facts and data, because I think that the best counter that you have to racism is a lot of facts. You want to educate them. As we know from our earlier workshop, a lot of this comes from fear and ignorance. So I think if you kind of tackle that, if you kind of give the evidence-based data, and then we had a lot. So once we put that information out, we had a lot of people saying, yes, you know, that's correct, or they would support it or augment that thought or that vision. So I think that's the way we did. But I think what worked for us also was that we documented the negative trolling and the negative feedback and comments, and we put it to our funder, you know, saying that, look, we did this amazing campaign, we had a great you know, project run for 6 months, but you know, this is the data that's telling you that we need more such projects. We need more such things where we can educate communities, bring them together on this dialogue. And I think that was a smart move, because we got funding for phase 2 of Dare 2, and here we are. So that's the ploy that we used, if I can call it.
I thought you'd be the best person to answer that question.
Great. And Nuzat, you had another question on the dark web, I think.
Yeah, so again, one of the people in our breakout room had wanted Barbara to talk about the dark web. And I think Barbara, you talked a little bit about those other platforms that exist. And also you gave examples of gaming platforms and music and so on. What else is there in the dark web that people refer to as the dark web?
Well, the dark web is a challenging space because it's largely unregulated, because, I mean, I wouldn't say totally. It depends on where it is and how it works. I mean, some of the dark web is, the encrypted, encoded, or password protected chat rooms, that sort of thing, that are occupied only by, these extremists and haters, if you will. And then we have the fringe platforms that are unregulated, because in fact they were created very often by far right extremists with the intent of avoiding the sorts of problems that they'd experienced on mainstream platforms. So I mean, there's very little sense in engaging with those on those fringe platforms, because they are dyed in the wool. They are the most extreme of the extreme. They're not going to listen to the facts, to the realities, right, that you bring to bear. So I think that our energies really need to be devoted to, in terms of the counter speech practices, really need to be devoted to those open and visible platforms where we are all, excuse me, where the broader public and other members of the community are also exposed, because then that's the audience that we're talking to as much as anything else. In terms of the gaming platforms and those sorts of things, I mean, YouTube, for example, there's not much that we can, I mean, I think the same strategies apply with YouTube as they do with Twitter and with Facebook. The gaming platform is a really different one, because it's just it's a very different world in terms of how it operates, whether you're on the game only or the chat rooms, that sort of thing. But I think there's still space for the same kinds of interventions in those kinds of areas, but they are going to be different because there is a tendency to be a little more subtle in if you're grooming in those kinds of context, because I mean, it is a recruitment strategy. People are luring people slowly into sort of more and more extreme positions over time. So we're actually working with John Howard Society right now to develop a safe gaming curriculum that will be for youth and to some extent adults as well, because it's not just youth who are on these games, but also that provide some guidance and direction for caregivers, so that they're aware of what's happening and they know what questions to ask and what to look for in that sort of context. So yeah, it's a slightly different kettle of fish, I think, when we get into the gaming platforms.
Thank you.
Dr. Perry, I have one quick question. Someone was wondering if you could name or let them know where they can apply for funding to offer workshops like these.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think that the Community Resilience Fund at Public Safety, which is, I think there's an annual call, more or less annual call. I think Heritage Canada will have some. I think the province of Ontario in the last couple of years has had a few funding opportunities. The Safer Communities Fund, I think it's Safer Communities Fund or grant, something like that, is one such initiative at the provincial level in Ontario. And I think that one hopes going forward we'll see many more opportunities there. But I think the starting point is to look at the websites associated with sort of relevant ministries, if you will: justice, public safety, heritage, this new one, diversity and inclusion, is that what it's called, at the federal level, and then probably not Solicitor General, but community and social services at the local level, perhaps even youth ministries at the provincial level, because again, a lot of the attention is on youth. Youth are not the only people that are implicated here, adults are as well. But some of the youth related ministries, the justice ministries, some provinces do have ministries for, they don't call them this, but for inclusion and diversity. So I would start there. And then, yeah, there are a lot of foundations as well, I think, that support this kind of work.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Well, if that is all, then just two pieces left. we have a post-workshop survey, and you'll go over to SurveyMonkey. You'll stay you'll stay logged in here to the workshop, but you will also link to SurveyMonkey and complete the post-workshop survey. But do come back, because we have one last piece for you. So this is really important. The pre-test was really important for giving us a sense of where you were, and I think it gave us a good foundation. This one is really important from the perspective of the funder in particular, in terms of what you take away, what you've learned, if you feel like your knowledge and your capacity has been enhanced. And hopefully this is just this set of workshops is the beginning of something that is sustainable. So really important that we get your sincere feedback on this, so that for the funder, but also so that we can, if we need to, we can also enhance the workshops going forward. So we really appreciate that. So the link is here, but I think Jasmine, you're also going to put the link in the chat. Is that right?
Yes, it's in the chat right now.
Okay, good. All right. So we'll give you 12 minutes or so to complete that survey, and we'll see you back here. What time do I have now? 1:53 to, what is it? What would that be? 2:10? No, that's not right. 12 minutes. 2:05. 2:05. We'll come back. Thank you. Oops.
I just want to add to Dr. Perry's request. Really imperative that you all fill out the SurveyMonkey. You can just copy and paste the URL into a tab, because I think more than the funder, I think this information that you provide us will help us know how we did at a workshop level, but also any gaps that we may have that we can improvise on and benefit our community. So please do take the time to fill out this survey for us. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I hope you all had time to complete that survey. That's a very formal indicator, I think, of your reaction and your takeaways from today's workshop. We just want to take an opportunity now to get a sense of how you're going to use what you've learned. And I think it's important to think about the first two questions as well as the second questions, because this was, this is the tip of the iceberg. This was, 3 hours of just a little bit of information and some resources to get you thinking and to give you really the basics about how to intervene individually and to some extent collectively as well. But it's important to think about this as a starting point, right? Are there other ways that you can continue to learn about what is happening online, the hate speech itself and the context and the rationale and the justifications, but also, increasing your understanding about how to engage or to disengage from that hate speech. So just want to give you, we've created just a collective Jamboard for this one. So you're not going to go into your groups, but you will go to Jamboard and share with us your thoughts in this. And it's essentially, this is your homework. Tell us what you're going to do to continue to deepen your learning, but also what are you going to try to do individually? Are you going to make an effort collectively, maybe within your chapter or within another organization, to develop some, even just a local strategy? What are you going to do? So I will turn it back to Jasmine for the big jam group, and off you go. So we'll just take, and because it's one big Jamboard, we're just going to watch them come up, and we'll just take about 4 minutes, I think 5 minutes, for you to post your thoughts.
Great, thanks, Dr. Perry. I just sent the link to the collective Jamboard into the chat. So if you're able to, you can open that up on a different tab. But we'll also have it open on Zoom so we can watch the responses come in on the sticky notes. Great responses so far. A lot of folks are saying reporting and documenting what they see, very crucial.
Yeah, and I think that sort of collective energy to report is important as well. As an individual, it might feel like we're not heard, but if, as I mentioned earlier on, if, you see something, it's that piece, what was it, delegate, encourage others in your circle to also report that same incident. And I think that enhances the likelihood that some action will be taken. Yeah, the screenshots you've all talked about, many of you are talking about documentation, so important. And the passing along. I mean, that is for us, the really, truly the bottom line is for you to share what you've learned today. I mean, use what you've learned today, obviously, but let's create a tsunami of reactions here. So encouraging people in your circles, friends, families, and other community organizations. I love this idea of creating, there was organized community workshops, but also there were a few others about communities, creating a page about how to respond to hate incidents for your local neighborhood websites. I mean, those sorts of things, they seem small, they seem like, they're localized, but it can create a groundswell, right? It's something worthy of emulation that others, in fact, might also copy. So yeah, I think some really great strategies here. And there's one I see, well, two actually that just jump out, not just because they're large letters, but because they're important. Think before taking action. I mean, that is so important, right? Is it is this the point where you should engage or should you disengage? And I think the example that Firdaus shared with us in terms of the post that you looked at, you know, there are times when you just walk away. If it's a one-off, just let it go, talk about something else, move on to a different conversation. Is it safe to intervene? If not, again, walk away. You have to think about the right context and the right kind of response. So sometimes it is important to take that step back. Advocate for the online anti-hate legislation. Absolutely. I think we really need to, just as we need to lobby social media to take reporting seriously, we also need to lobby the government to, you know, really take action on online hate. You know, the hate crime legislation that we have is not used effectively. I think I think people see it as a stretch to apply that legislation to online hate, which I don't know why it should be. But if we need distinct legislation for that reason, I think this is definitely the time to push for it. There's certainly, I think, some appetite for it anyway. Make political leaders and social media companies accountable. So lots of great strategies here. Teach my kids these strategies. Absolutely. I know we have some youth with us. You know, we're not all old folks like me. We do have some youth, and you know, they'll teach their peers, but also very important that we teach our youth these same kinds of strategies. I mean, they're probably, especially right now, they're online more than we are even, so perhaps even more vulnerable to and susceptible to this kind of language. So that is certainly, you know, one of the demographics that we need to take these lessons back to. So yeah, so much coming up here. So I really appreciate that. Very thoughtful and you know, exactly the sorts of things that we had hoped that you would take away. So please do hold yourselves accountable to these calls to action now, and you know, with our encouragement and our blessing, please do take these lessons back to your community, to your family, to your social media family as well, and help us to counter and to push back against hate online. And I thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to, well, I guess actually, Jasmine, you can take over from here, because from here on in, it's sort of the contact information. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to all of you for participating, and thank you all at CCMW for inviting me and giving me the honor of sharing some of my knowledge and experience with the group as well. So thank you so much, and all the best to all of you.
Okay, I believe now it's my turn to speak.
Yes, Nuzhat, I just wanted to thank Dr. Perry for doing such a wonderful job. I think she's amazing. This is our second workshop, and we're so happy that we have Dr. Perry to guide us and mentor us through this journey. So I'll let you take this on, Nuzhat.
Yes, so thank you again, Dr. Perry, and Firdaus and the rest of our amazing Dare to team. So Firdaus Ali is the project manager, and she's supported by Jasmine Al-Ghami, who did an amazing job of keeping us well equipped with the Jamboards and instructions for us to participate. I also want to thank Iman, who was named questions in the session, and of course Zainab Jamal, who's been managing traffic in and out of the session. Amazing team. And of course, we have to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for funding this amazing project. I know many of you asked about availability of the materials. So we're going to be hosting 2 focus groups in August, and we're going to unpack your feedback, take your ideas on how to improve the packages before you roll these out in your communities. Remember, our commitment is for you to take these Train the Trainer workshops and then hopefully take them on the road or virtually and share these in your own communities across the country. So you will be invited to those focus groups, which will take place in August. and watch your email in July for notification about those. And then, of course, we will be sharing these packages with you along with a workshop manual on conducting your local workshops. I hope I didn't miss anything, and I hope I didn't miss anyone in my thanks. But again, thank you all for joining us today on a beautiful, sunny summer day in Toronto. I'm not sure what the weather's like elsewhere, but it's gorgeous here. Actually, it's hot, but very sunny. For future events and initiatives with CCMW, make sure to follow us on our social channels. We're available on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Check out our YouTube videos, which actually can be accessed on our website at CCMW Live. And for the workshop schedules, please go to our daretobeaware.ca website, and you can see the full schedule there. If you need more information, please contact us. So you see the contact information there for Firdaus Ali, who's, as I said, she's a project manager for this, and Dr. Perry, who's at the university. You can reach her there, and Jasmine, who's on our team here. And we look forward to seeing you at other workshops and events. And if you didn't take the Anti-Islamophobia 101 workshop yet, please do join us. We have one tomorrow, and then there'll be more that'll be coming over the next few weeks. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon. Firdaus, did I miss anything?
No, Nuzhat, you covered it all. So, but thank you all for attending. I just have one excellent feedback from Talat, one of our chapter members, that I'd like to read before we wind up for the day. She says, my suggestion is that since CCMW is a national organization, we should set up a portal where women can hate reporting, as many events are unreported. We can then assess the volume on hate crime.
Yeah, now you can go because we've got time. All right, I'm just.
Actually, so Firdaus, isn't it ironic, or not ironic, isn't it timely that we were just talking about that within the CCMW team yesterday, and how to make that happen, what Talat is saying, make that happen.
Yes.
So Talat, stay tuned. CCMW doesn't sit quietly. It likes to act. So we are working on, or at least considering something like that.
Right. And just one more question was on the certificate. So all those who've attended both workshops, they should be receiving the certificate early July. So just bear with us. We have a few more workshops this month that we need to take care of, and all hands on deck. But you should receive an email with the online certificate early July. So thank you. And thank you all for attending and committing your time on this Saturday morning and afternoon for being with us. Amazing to have you all. And please refer your friends and family to this workshop if you liked it. Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz.